harp is a vehicle for self-expression, but it shouldn't be what defines what you play.
How are you doing today, Amelia?
I'm doing really well. Thank you.
It's so good to talk to you again and again. For the audience here, Amelia and I actually have been getting in touch quite a bit in the past, talking about a very exciting project that she's working on, which now has materialized to a album. And that's why we're here to talk about the things that we're going to chat about today. We're going to look at finding our musical identity. And I do have a set of questions that I would like to follow because I'm hoping to connect with another harpist who also went through a similar process, but come up with something quite different and get her take on finding her musical identity. So I'm hoping the two of you is going to answer the same question, but share very different stories and perspective. So I might look down on my sheet for my questions every so often, but let's start by talking about this album, Lever Engage. How would you describe the sound of this album?
The sound really looks to show how far-reaching lever harp can be. So there are very soothing moments, but there are also very dynamic, full, rich moments that you might not expect to hear on lever harp. The sound, I would like to say, showcases the instrument's limitless potential.
And I think that certainly you managed to capture that in the 20 pieces that are in the album. It's a very extensive album, and as I have been listening to it in the last little while, I was really struck by the different emotions and sounds that are coming out in the different pieces of music. So tell us about your journey that leads you to doing this. When do you realize that this is what you want to put together in an album? What went on in your mind as you compiled this set of music?
Yeah, so the backstory is that when the pandemic hit, I decided to go back to school because I really wanted to get a music degree on lever harp. And when I initially done my undergraduate studies, there wasn't really a program that matched my needs. So I went to San Francisco State University and I decided I really wanted to learn as much repertoire as possible during my time. So every semester, every 4 months, I put together a recital. And I was working really diligently and doing the first 2 semesters I did a virtual recital. And my teacher, Karen Gottlieb, said, why don't you record every piece of your recital? So I just started compiling all these works that I'd recorded throughout 5 recitals. And by the time my final master's recital came, I thought, why not put, or rather select, a number of works that really spoke to me that I feel highlight my journey in discovering chromatic works that work on lever harp and put them into an album. So that's kind of where the idea was born. And as the title goes, Classical Reimaginations for Harp. I was taking classical works that were written for piano or pedal harp in some cases and reworking them so that I could play them on lever harp. So
And
the
why
idea,
the
yeah.
lever harp? Like, why? That is such an interesting instrument to choose to study at the university level. What drew you into that?
I think I don't really like following expectations in the norm. So there's a lot of programs in Scottish and Irish and folk harp, and those traditions are so rich and beautiful. And yet I find the classical works and the contemporary works and some jazz works so compelling. And as we know, to do anything well, it takes many, many hours. And my excitement in those genres was just so full and rich that I knew that was the direction I wanted to take it. And why I've never gone to pedal harp is, well, they are large, but mostly because of the tone and the sound that I can get on my lever harp that's so satisfying. But also, we don't know what our expectations are for an instrument until someone does something that breaks those. And I really like to break expectations. And I think playing classical works on lever harp, you realize, wait, this is actually possible. Yes, you have to do a lot of planning to get all the lever shifts to happen musically, but you always have to do that in music. It's just maybe refocusing your energy from pedals to levers.
Yeah, and we did had a chat earlier in the year to talk about lever shifting, which I'm very fond of. So good on you for spending all this time in working out how to play chromatic music on the lever harp. And what are some of the inspiration in the selection of music that you choose to work through in your program? Why these music? You already allude to some of those, but let's expand on that.
Yeah, so I listened through to all the recordings, and some of the pieces work on lever harp, but they don't necessarily make the instrument sing in the same way. So I found what chromatic pieces, for example, really worked. Toccata by Paradisi is just a great example. It goes so many tonal places, but it really sings on the lever harp. And then the work that I continue to perform is Brandy Younger's Essence of Ruby. And this work is definitely intended for pedal because every 4 measures it changes tonal centers and you actually hear the lever shifting happening. And I say it kind of adds a percussive element to the piece. But those are works that I just really want to show, yes, this is possible in lever harp. You really can make these pieces come alive like they do on pedal. You might take down the tempo a little bit, but it won't take away from the work itself. And then Pearl Chair Talk's Beige Nocturne, another really lovely work that was written for pedal harp. So I want to include pieces that people would definitely not associate with lever harp, but I also wanted to honor composers like, for example, Bernardo Andres, who's done a lot of compositions for lever harp that sound beautiful. So I selected a number of his works as well. So I kind of wanted to give a balanced perspective of what is possible on lever harp in the chromatic world, what is beautiful and important to acknowledge in the lever repertoire, and then what are pieces that you just never would consider on harp, period, like Philip Glass's Metamorphosis. Not that it's really chromatic, but it was written for piano, and he has such a wide variety of repertoire that goes other places that wouldn't necessarily suit the harp as well. But Metamorphosis too sits so nicely on the instrument.
Yeah, and I do want to make a comment that as you have been working through your music and we have been connecting and you have been showing me the music that you choose, there's an element of surprise every time I hear what you end up choosing, because I remember you challenging me to identify some music to play on the lever harp, and I go for the very stereotypical things and didn't seem quite to be able to work beyond that little box that I have put myself in. So it's really interesting to see your approach in sort of considering what could be suitable for this instrument, and making it, like you said, sing, right? So I really enjoy that. What are some of the values and beliefs that guide you through the process as you're creating this album? And you already talk about honoring the instrument and really acknowledging sort of the different things that this instrument can do. Is there anything else that you really believe in when you are working through this master program of yours and doing the work to transcribe these music for lever harp?
Yeah, in the world of composing, there's not as much repertoire for pedal or lever harp like there are for other instruments. There's such a vast world out there, and I captured in some cases in the album. Another work that you don't hear that often is Bella Bartok's An Evening in the Village, and I think the album and the program really gave me the opportunity to keep noticing the places that I wasn't exploring before. Like, oh wait, I didn't even know about this composer. Oh wait, this can really be possible. Or at the end of the day, how can you find music and compose without thinking about your instrument? Because I don't think we necessarily notice it as players, but outside of the symphonic world, we often choose repertoire because it's a standard piece that everyone needs to learn for technique and musical knowledge. Or this composer is just very famous and everyone wants to learn his piece or her piece. But how can you just explore repertoire just for the sake of really great music that's made a mark on history? And so like Scarlatti's sonatas. Scarlatti wrote over 500 sonatas, and I knew of him, but I wasn't really aware of his playful style and how, he didn't think about harp, let alone lever harp, when he was writing these works in the 1700s. It was all keyboard or piano. Ultimately, even though this is an album featuring solo harp in a range of classical styles, it's really an album featuring the breadth of kind of composition over several centuries in little nuggets. Like, here's a delightful moment, and here's a delightful moment. And yes, it's played on a harp, but I want people to hear it and feel like they're discovering like a treasure chest of music versus just another series of harp ideas. So it's as we think about it, or I like to think about it, harp is a vehicle for self-expression, but it shouldn't be what defines what you play, or shouldn't just exclusively shape what you play.
I think what you just said there is the perfect sort of response to what I said about myself picking the stereotypical harp repertoire music to try to work on the lever harp. And what I really get from you in what you just said is that you're not bound by the instrument, but rather you're there to explore the music. And I think that perspective really opens up a whole new possibility of what we can do on the harp, which I think is so important in what you have done in this album here. Because like you said, not a lot of these are particularly written for the harp, let alone the lever harp. So I think that's wonderful.
One more comment on that line, the Scarlatti sonatas, Marcia Dick Stein adapted them for lever harp, and I am super grateful to her because I probably wouldn't have just gone and found them myself and put them together. But in the process of going through them, I found new ideas of expanding even from where she put her mark, and they again work in some cases, I think, almost in their own way. They come to life in a different manner than on keyboard. I will mention keyboard plays them probably 50 BPM faster. It's like this very quick, delightful experience. It's so important when you're adapting and reimagining works to understand what was the composer intending. If they were intending for a certain idea or feeling or mood to be captured, maybe on keyboard this tempo works great, but for harp, it just doesn't make as much sense. So it was very fun for me to also really have to think about how do you keep the integrity of what the composer intended, but modify what is needed for the instrument you're using. So it's kind of the two sides. How do you work beyond the instrument, but also honor it to create your imaginations or reimaginations?
Yeah, absolutely. And what was the experience that you would like your audience to walk away with when they listen to your music?
Reignite their curiosity to explore if it's other lever harp albums or go to more concerts to hear lever harp. I think harp in general, there's maybe one or two in the symphony. And then when it comes to lever harp, many people aren't familiar even with the particular harp. So I think if it can just open doors or inspire the desire to engage more with the instrument, and or listen to these new pieces of repertoire that they may have not even knew existed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, personally, I will tell you that if I look at the list of music alone, I probably wouldn't get the album because I have certain stereotypes that I associate with the music that I may or may not enjoy. But the hope for me was the instrument. So in my case, I think the fact that these pieces are played on the lever harp has got me really curious into listening to the piece, and they are very pleasantly surprising to me. And I hope that maybe for audience who have listened to these pieces on other instrument would listen to your work in this album and kind of figure out like, what is it like on a lever harp? Do they even know they're hearing it on a completely different instrument? We'd love to know that. So if the audience have listened to the album and you had any thoughts, please share in the comment. We'd love to hear what your takeaway in the album is. Yeah. So my next question for you is that chromatic music on the lever harp is not necessarily uncommon, but it's not done very widely, right? What did you find most difficult in terms of finding your personal mark in doing chromatic music on the lever harp?
Before I even think about chromatic music, I think finding repertoire that's really compelling and interesting. And when I use those descriptors, something that makes me stop and have to listen a little more carefully, or something that if I look at a piece of music and I'm not quite sure how to approach it, I think that's what excites me, and it happens to often involve lever shifting. And I think what was probably most exciting for me in my entire program was working with my teacher to look at a piece and figure out what adjustments can be made to keep the integrity and yet be able to make all the shifts that were needed. Some individuals focus on playing something exactly as the composer intended, but many performances will vary a little bit. And I think what I found challenging but exciting is finding a way to really keep the piece alive and use the strengths of the lever harp to highlight the how the chromaticism actually works quite well. And as we both know, I did an article in the harp column solving 5 tips to solving chromatic conundrums. And that was something that really was kind of at the heart of all of it, which is how do you make these little adjustments to make the piece stay really come alive on the instrument without compromising, but making it fun for both the listener and the performer. I think I always have to remind myself that I do chromatic music because it opens new doors in terms of tonal centers. Moving between tonal centers is really something I didn't do much as a child. And as an adult now, that experience, it opens many worlds, but you also have to think about how do I make this repertoire interesting for the listener who may or may not want to visually see all this motion. So it was the act of how to modify and then how to visually keep it as musical as it is sonically musical. So it's a learning curve, but I now, every time I approach a new piece, I have a sense for how to continue using those tools to make the performance satisfying for both listener and performer.
Yeah. And when I met with you in San Francisco, we worked through a piece of music, and it's kind of like looking at you putting a puzzle, solving a puzzle together, and it's really interesting process. Out of the pieces that you have adapted for this album, which one you had the most fun solving the puzzle to make it work on the lever harp, or which one it kind of give you the most satisfaction in a sense of, you know, you gain a lot of learning and pleasure out of working that piece of music for the lever harp? Which one would that be? Tell us a little bit.
It's fun. I didn't mention this earlier, but I have never recorded an album over the course of 2 years, but I recorded each series of recital pieces. So in February, I had like 45 pieces to listen through to. And I think 2 of the pieces that got on the album that I found really compelling and interesting was Prelude in C by Prokofiev, written for piano, and then Toccata that I mentioned earlier, written by Paradisi. And both these works are very, very chromatic and very much intended for pedal harp, but they work so brilliantly on lever harp because it's less tension and it has this brighter sound. And Toccata, even though there's numerous repeats in the work, it comes alive so easily on the lever harp. And so those are 2 pieces that I think stand out just in terms of the experience of listening to good music, where you say, oh wow, this is just really fun and interesting. And I guess the other 2 that I play a lot now still are Beige Nocturne and Brandy Younger's Essence of Ruby. And both those are somewhat similar moods, but they really use the full range of the instrument. And again, as we know, every harp has a different timbre. But those works really shine in the timbre of the lever harp and the harp that I use to play it on, because I use 2 harps and it just depends on what key the piece is in and what harp I choose to play on.
Mm-hmm. And I'm working on Beige Nocturne right now, which, by the way, for the audience, if you don't know, there will be sheet music from some of these works in the album. So if you want to try it, you're going to have to keep an eye on Amelia's store. But I am getting an advanced copy of the Beige Nocturne, and I'm just looking at how brilliantly you have fitted into the lever harp, because when I watched a video of that piece on YouTube on the pedal harp, I'm like, there's no way this can work on the lever harp. Do you find the process of adapting that, and also Brandy Younger's Essence of Ruby, really something that kind of even compel you more to think about what else the album to do? I really want to ask that, because I feel like those 2 pieces had, for me, is the other one that are boundary breaking and really defy the expectation. And I'm wondering if there's more you think that you haven't gone to yet in this album that you might want to try.
You know, I debated doing Prokofiev's Prelude in C, And I was in conversation with another harpist who does a lot of reimaginations, and I've had to realize that in some cases people might want to learn it, but oftentimes, like Prelude in C, it's a really great piece to listen to, but the right hand involves just a lot of technical work that, you know, when it comes to inviting people to learn pieces, it's how accessible are they? I found a lot of classical repertoire written or adapted for lever harp maybe took away sometimes from the piece itself. And so I think my reimaginations, kind of the goal is how to keep intact the interesting chromatic relationships and rhythms while maybe taking out a few notes here and there that aren't mandatory to communicating the message. And yeah, some pieces just seem it's like how simplifying might take away from the piece itself. I think the Beige Nocturne and Essence of Ruby, you really can work around them and make and bring out everything that the composer would want to, or I would think they would want to. So I'll see. I mean, I kind of just went off of what pieces did I love and definitely want the lover community to have access to. But I think it's, as I tell my seminar participants, it's as much of me creating and then sharing as it is a dialogue. And I always ask lever players, what do you want to see for lever harp? Where do you want this instrument to go? Mm-hmm. Because we decide what content is created by asking for it, and or by creating something and then seeing the response to it. I'm kind of curious to see who engages with these adaptations and wants to see more music of this type out there, because it's kind of, once you have a certain set of tools to reimagine something, you can apply it to any piece. And I was in Portland this past weekend doing a workshop, and one of the participants is a pedal harp player and is wanting to do more on lever harp, and she sent me a work that had some modifications she had made after our workshop. So again, it's about keeping that conversation going to know where the next steps are.
I love that. We can co-create a future for the lever harp that hasn't been written yet.
Yeah, as you say to me, you'll ask, well, why don't you change the key to this so more lever harp players can play it? And it's about thinking outside the individual box, because we all have our boxes, and that's kind of, I think, I mean, now that we're talking about this, I think that's kind of the theme of this album, is really how can we continue to recognize and move beyond the stereotypes or expectations or ideas of what something is, because that's evolution and growth.
Love it. Okay, now I'm going to go back to one of my pre-scripted questions in here. What are your thoughts on learning and mimicking the work of musicians that we respect or admire? Do you think that help us in finding our own sound? And if so, how?
I mean, all music is just one mimic after another, and the most brilliant ones stick. So I think, as they say, to be a great anything, you first have to copy the greats, memorize their solos, learn their pieces, analyze their works, and then start finding your own sense of it. So I think it's delightful and important. I don't know that. I actually, on that note, it'll be kind of interesting to see where my original works go, because I mean, this is the first album I've ever released that has none of my ideas on it in terms of original work. Yes, I reimagined these pieces in some capacities, but who knows how these works will inform my compositions going forward. And I think it's so important to learn from the greats and take those ideas. And the biggest piece to it all is to acknowledge it. I think in all the programs I present these works, I acknowledge this is the composer and they were influenced by these other individuals, because no one is in isolation, especially in the performing arts.
Yeah. And I mean, I've listened to your previous work, and lever shifting is nothing new to you necessarily. But I have a hunch that perhaps what you have done in the past has kind of inspired you to dig deeper into this world, which leads to the work that you're presenting to us in this album. And I have no doubt you're going to take it to another direction later, because that's who you are. So I would love
I'm hoping I'll stay with this general theme, because again, on the topic of judging or having expectations or whatnot, individuals that kind of always jump around, I wonder of the depth of what they're creating. But I think there's a continuity line, or I hope so, in the work that I've done, because even though I started with a lot more world music and composition and original music, it keeps to inform the perspective I'm able to give to this classical work. I'm not looking to just create exactly what someone else has done, but rather get the idea out there, but in a new perspective or format. So yeah, I think it all informs everything. And ultimately, I always say to anyone who asks me about it, I say I want to include both worlds. I want to include the creative, improvisational, compositional world, and I also want to include the classical, technical world, because they together they're just simply stronger and more engaging. A program that really encompasses, as this album does, so much of what lever harp has to offer.
Yeah, and I think even remembering the conversation of bantering on the name for the album, and it's so hard to distill all those things that you want to convey into a very short, concise album title, isn't it? So, but I think for the listener, check out the backstory. There's a QR code in there. I think that would give some perspective too on sort of how you arrive to this set of work. That's awesome. What are some of the unexpected challenge that you have run into in the making of this album?
So when I was recording, I didn't think much about what I was going to do with the recording. So when it came to lever shifting, I just kept my mics the same and hit the record button and did the act of playing. And the focus was creating a good take, as we all have. But because I didn't do it all in a studio setting, it required a lot of post-production editing to make the album feel more alive, like it was in a concert space. So that was something that I had to do a lot of work with the engineer that mixed and mastered the album, Simon Tassano. He's based on the East Coast, and I would just basically send the tracks to him and say, this is the sound I'm looking for. And we had a lot of great conversations, but I learned a ton about, one, how to go forward in the future to capture the best sound on both my harps, but also, because I was doing so much lever shifting, where to position mics so that the levers in some cases work with the music, meaning the rhythm of the shifts become percussive in the performance of the work. But in other cases, when the levers don't support the piece as much, how to minimize their impact in the listening process. So that was the biggest take home for me, and I definitely I won't necessarily always go to a studio in the future, but have a setup where the mics are in a position to highlight really the full richness of the instrument, but maybe not amplify the shifts so much. I think that was kind of the biggest takeaway from this particular series.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because when I watch you perform, because we have the visual element and we can see the lever shift, we don't pay attention to the sound of the levers the same way. So yeah, it's interesting that you kind of have to mitigate that in an album setting where we don't see the visual.
Well, again, we don't know what others are thinking about, because we're in our own mind when we're recording and performing. And to me, hearing the lever shifts, just like when you're performing and you think something sounds good because your ear is right next to the string, but you don't realize that the person in the 20th row doesn't know that you're still playing, right? And it's the same idea when you're recording, because like you're saying, Victoria, we're used to seeing the visual of the lever shifts, and it's such a central part to what I do. I don't think I want everyone to notice it and enjoy it and be as excited about it as I am. But the truth is, why I do it is so that we can move beyond certain styles or certain keys. I don't do it for just the visual circus. So it was really having to step outside of my own mindset in recording and say, what experience do I want the listener to have? And actually go through and mark all the places where the lever shifts happened, where they didn't benefit the music, and see if they could be minimized.
Very interesting insight. Thank you for sharing that. And what are some of your favorite memories from the making of this album?
I think it's really special to go through a program and capture all the music that you recorded, because this album is about 70 minutes, but I had in the end probably an hour and a half of recorded repertoire. So I got to revisit all the choices I made in terms of what pieces I was going to work on, and then the best takes of what I came up with in the course of 2.5 years. And so it was a walk down memory lane, and I think that was special for me to kind of see where what had worked well, what hadn't worked as well, but was an important learning process. And I mean, this album now, as many artists probably can appreciate, you spend several months, etc., listening through an album, and then once you finish it and release it, you just take a break. So I actually haven't listened to the album in a bit, but what I did enjoy most in the final process is just putting it into my CD player and kind of seeing where my mind went and having that experience and just reflecting back on the journey I'd gone through and the different time periods and composers that contributed so much to, yeah, inspiring me to make the album. That was satisfying.
Yeah. And you already mentioned, I was going to ask you, do you see yourself continuing down this path? And you already said this is kind of what you want to do for the next little while anyway. Is there something else that you would like to throw into the mix to kind of spice it up? Or do you see yourself maybe bringing some other elements from your past into what you're going to do that you haven't already done? You speak about composing. Are you going to write some music, you think?
Well, it's funny you ask because the final part of my master's recital was a piece that I had written without using the lever harp as my muse. I simply wrote a work in sonata form, and it didn't work as a solo lever piece, but then I orchestrated it for trio, and I performed it at my recital. So I do want to do more composing again. The ideal world would be composing that brings in Latin American styles as well as classical form, and make it into solo as well as chamber works for the instrument. So I think future programs will be a mixture of here's a couple original works that celebrate the fusion of these worlds, and then here's some classical works that have been reimagined for the instrument. And I think that's kind of where my future is going. A composer that I really enjoyed listening to and been inspired by is William Grant Still, and he did exactly that in the 1950s and 60s and 70s in Chicago. He was an African-American composer, but he was taking jazz idioms and applying them to classical form. And he was the first of many, like first to conduct a major symphony, first to compose a symphonic work that did this fusion of musical ideas. But ultimately, all music is just a melting pot. And the more we learn about the background of pieces or composers, the more we realize that nothing is in isolation. So I'd like to really just do exactly that, kind of celebrate the different worlds that I find we might not expect to hear together, but they work so well, like so many of my colleagues do. So I think that's kind of where my future's headed. one of the places. We'll see what actually happens, but I sense that is a direction.
Nice. And I think there is still a lot you can do, even if you just stay in this current space, because there's so much music out there. Like you will tell me a new piece of music that I have not heard before, and you're like, look at this, it sounds so good on the liver harp. I'm like, I've never thought that was even a thing. So I think there's still so much that can be done.
And I think one of the next steps I would love is just to write individuals that are familiar with different classical works and say, send me your favorite classical tune you'd like to hear on lever harp. Because I've been doing seminars where I have participants bring in a piece they want to arrange for the instrument, and there's just we all inform one another. And the reason why we play great works is because someone else suggests something, and then it brings us on a journey to find the sound that we're most inspired by. So that probably will be another direction I go, where I just invite people to send me works that they love as a piece of music, but didn't think about the instrument with that piece.
So if you're an audience watching this interview and you have a piece of music that you think maybe Amelia would like to listen to, her email address is on her website, so reach out to her.
Send me it. And I think there's a lot of beautiful slower music that works obviously well on lever harp, but I think finding like the toccata on the album or the prelude in C, as I write in the harp column article, with a few modifications, any piece is possible.
Mm-hmm. And I do like the energy of, like Essence of Ruby, for example, that you can still convey on the lever harp. And I think for me, those are the things that I found exciting because I like exciting works. And yeah, I would love to hear more about the kind of music that you're going to explore going forward. So we'll have to stay in touch. You're going to have to tell me all the music that you got yourself.
Yeah, no, it's very fun.
For musicians who are finding their own music style and sound, what is something you would like them to remember? Is there a lesson learned that you have in your journey so far that you think would be good to share with us?
I think I have found for myself that going to concerts is one of the best ways to engage in the love of learning and refining music. Even though it's great to just listen to music all the time, I find that when I'm not practicing, I'm not always as good at listening to the music that will inform my practice. But going to concerts and finding, like anything in life, what excites you versus what, that was a good experience. I want to do something else or move on. So I think just immerse yourself and trust your gut in finding those pieces, because as we all know, any work that you want to bring to a certain level requires time. So you want to love it, and you can only know that you love it by knowing what's out there.
Yeah, and I do find finding what's out there can be tricky because I think as human we have the tendency to go for the things we know and stay away from the things that we don't know. And I have really learned the value of exploring different music since I started Talking Harps, because all my guests do very different things, and every one of them managed to surprise me in some shape or form. So there's so much out there. And I really want to say thank you, Amelia, for sharing your journey on this album with us. I know we have talked a lot privately, but this is an opportunity for you to share that with our audience. And what a fascinating journey. And I'm really honored to have a lever shifting friend like you, because it is not something that I see very frequently, that someone sort of embrace lever shifting to the same degree as we are. We're a little nutty, but hey, let's face it, we're into it.
When I think the beauty of skill is finding people that are just so deeply passionate about an array of things and carve paths with that. So hooray to that. And yeah, thank you so much for asking these insightful and thought-provoking questions.
And as usual, I don't think you're gonna be not coming back later. So I'm gonna have to end this by saying that we'll probably chat again soon. And if you would like to check out Amelia's album, you can find the links to how to purchase it on her website, which I'm gonna put in the video description. The sheet music book will be coming out later in the year, so keep an eye on her website if you would like to play some of these. It will be really fun, I think, to try out some of them. And again, if you have interesting music that you want to share with Amelia, reach out to her.
Please
I'm sure
do.
she would love to hear from you.
Definitely.
Take care, Amelia.
Thank you so much, Victoria.